What I'd like to do is get started. At this time, I'd like to welcome Joe Lubin to the stage along with Chris. Joe is the co-founder of blockchain computing platform Ethereum, and the founder of ConsenSys Systems, a blockchain venture studio. ConsenSys is one of the largest and fastest growing companies in the blockchain technology space, building developer tools, decentralized applications, and solutions for enterprises and governments that harness the power of Ethereum. Headquartered in New York, ConsenSys also has a global presence employing top entrepreneurs, computer scientists, software developers, and experts in enterprise delivery worldwide. So with that, I will turn over to the two of you.
Joe, thank you so much for joining us. And again, for these roundtables, I can only imagine how busy you are, and the fact that you've taken the time to come out here and to talk to our Washington, D.C. audience, it's just much appreciated, and thanks for taking the time. So I guess I'll start with how I had started with Brad. Today's a big day. We've had a number of conversations about Mark Zuckerberg's comments on the Hill about Libra. What's your view of Libra? And then I'll get into stablecoins and other issues and Ethereum and the like. But it's got to be pretty remarkable to see a conversation about cryptocurrencies, about a cryptocurrency, or at least an attempt to create a cryptocurrency on the Hill. What's your evaluation of this particular project?
Well, in very general terms, I don't mind a project structured like Libra. There is the issue that they essentially, in presenting it to the world, co-opted some of the verbiage and the phraseology of our blockchain ecosystem. So it was both validation, which was nice for us to see, but not entirely accurate or not entirely rigorous in terms of banking the unbanked, perhaps, and that's a really difficult problem in lots of different contexts. I do believe that
Can you just sort of explain that particular observation? You said it wasn't rigorous.
Banking?
No. In terms of it, it's true.
So
hey, nowadays.
So they were relying on this notion of decentralization. And let me get into that. So the value of the technology is that you have this new kind of database that enables lots of different records to be kept and many different actors to have direct access to using those systems and reading those systems and being certain that it's incredibly difficult to improperly manipulate those systems. So that's the value of decentralization. From decentralization, you get this trust characteristic. And from this trust characteristic, you can get a few things. One, you can get digital scarcity. You can get cryptocurrency and other kinds of digital assets from that. Maybe even more importantly, you get trusted collaboration. And so on networks structured like Libra, we've seen a few of those already, and we'll see hopefully many, many more. You can get collaboration between a whole bunch of different actors that want to interoperate with one another, but don't necessarily trust each other fully, and the mathematics and the crypto economics of the situation enable everybody to trust what goes on in the system and to believe that nobody's cheating that system. And so we should see lots of collaboration networks. We will see lots of collaboration networks, whether they are maximally decentralized, like Bitcoin and Ethereum, or whether they are minimally viably decentralized, as we've built commodity trade finance networks, one called Comgo, and there are many other of those that should exist because they bring better collaboration to lots of different situations that didn't quite have it. Libra itself is not problematic, though I would just love to divorce the whole concept of Libra from the entity Facebook, which has its own issues, I think. Also issues with respect to trust on the downside of the trust characteristic, I think. So it, in my opinion, is dangerous what Facebook does in terms of using technology to understand us better than we understand ourselves, using the technology to addict us to their systems, selling our attention and our personal information more and at higher prices because of essentially addicting us, tracking us through various different mechanisms, and essentially as a sort of negative externality, having become a weapon of mass societal manipulation. So Facebook aside, we should see lots of these Libra systems. One other piece is that our money systems, as good as they are in many different nations, are not so good in other nations, and every one of them throughout history has failed. So the average lifespan of a nation-state currency is about 70 years, and so you get into these dynamics where interest or chopping off little pieces of a coin devalues the currency, and so we are, in my opinion, in an end-of-life scenario with a bunch of the currencies around the world, and
major currencies as well, or
so major currencies as well. I mean, we are moving into recession at some point soon with the inversion of the yield curve, and central banks around the world don't have a lot of dry powder left in terms of their ability to stimulate economies by lowering interest rates, because they're very low already. Some are negative, and so we're going to see in the next recession a movement, a rapid and strong movement into quantitative easing, and that's going to further devalue the currencies, and it can get to non-linear and catastrophic fairly quickly. We could see a contagion, and so what I think we might end up seeing is price-stable currencies built on top of nation-state currencies, or built on top of nation-state bonds, or baskets of commodities, or other kinds of constructions. So it would be bad if there was one major one like Libra, controlled by a international entity that has 2.3 or 2.4 billion cyber citizens, because essentially that entity would end up controlling the monetary policy for small and medium-sized nations. It would be good to have a bunch of these price-stable currencies that facilitated cross-border payments, or that were price stable, because many countries don't have price stable currencies, and so the countries themselves, the citizens of those countries, would benefit from that. But we need many of those. We need choice. We need different characteristics of them, so that your smaller, medium-sized nation has a choice between 5 or 30 or 100 of these things, and can move to one or move to other ones if one of them goes sideways. So I sort of see a layer 2 solution for a new monetary regime. I'm not an expert in the space at all, but I think we can probably get there and sort of rescue the monetary systems of the world with this new technology.
That was extremely interesting, because what you're really identifying was, okay, on the one hand, there's, let's call it the entity question, which is whether or not you're going to have an issuer of this new international currency. Some economists may call it like a currency board. Whatever you're operating, if you're in finance, there's a certain degree of trust that the stakeholders have to have in the system, and so there's this a query, whether or not Facebook as an entity has that trust. But then you moved into sort of the design question for I'll call it the consumer, for the nation-state consumer of the currency, which is
or the consumer of the currency,
and by extension the consumer of the currency.
It doesn't actually have to be the nation-state involved. It could just be citizens of Argentina have a currency that they use to buy things in different places, locally or internationally.
Yeah. And those design issues can pop up. Now, again, the popular imagination, when you talk to most Americans and you talk about cryptocurrencies, they tend to know Bitcoin, because everyone knows Bitcoin, and it's in the news. And then obviously because of Libra and Facebook, people are more and more familiar with Libra. But when you get to something like Ether and the Ethereum blockchain, that's not necessarily, even with the capitalization of Ether, it's not something that most people are exactly aware of. But what it does do is highlight the different kinds of use cases for digital assets more generally, because it's not just the question of a currency, or it's not even a payment system, it's a kind of programmable
Sure.
A system. And maybe you could just sort of walk folks very briefly through sort of what distinguishes you from some of the major cryptocurrencies out there, like a Libra and Bitcoin.
Yeah, so Bitcoin is sometimes called programmable money. Ether, the token on the Ethereum platform, is definitely called programmable money because it's much more programmable. It has essentially the difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum is that Bitcoin is a blockchain-based system in the service of this token, this monetary token, Bitcoin, whereas Ethereum has a token, Ether, but it sits in service of this decentralized application platform. So it's a platform for automated and objective trust, for trusted transactions, guaranteed execution agreements. It's for building programs on. And those programs can control money with great complexity and granularity. And so we can set up wallets that do arbitrarily smart things with a wide variety of different assets. It can be that native asset Ether on the Ethereum platform. And the native asset Ether it's less of a cryptocurrency, although it's a very good cryptocurrency, but it's more of a crypto fuel or a crypto commodity because you need to use it to pay to run the programs and to store data on the Ethereum system. And so some of the programs that we can run on Ethereum involve a space that is exploding right now called open or decentralized finance. And so taking programmable money even further, turning it into programmable natively digital assets. So Ether is a natively digital asset, it's a commodity, but we're seeing equities and bonds, we're seeing major banks issue bonds, we'll soon see municipalities issue bonds. We are seeing lending, borrowing, payments, price stable tokens, subscription systems, and so upon this base trust layer, because of its decentralized characteristics, we can trust it. We can now build what we're thinking of as a global settlement layer for different assets, so that you can trade a money against an equity or other kinds of instruments against one another perfectly trustlessly or permissionlessly. And so there are other kinds of these tokens and networks around the world. There's some that are focusing on privacy, so shielding transactions. That is less popular in this town, I believe, but it is a technology that's out there.
So really thinking about the Ethereum blockchain as sort of the base layer upon which all these different sort of applications can ultimately be built. There's a lot of news coming out that you've released, and I'd like to explore a little bit of that, this concept of Ethereum 2.0. Sure. And first of all, what was sort of wrong with 1.0, and then what exactly are you trying to build out through this sort of upgrade?
Sure. So Bitcoin was released onto the world as a white paper at the end of 2008, and the system was released in 2009. And a few people were running it, and almost nobody in the world knew what was going on for a couple years, really. Eventually, it picked up some steam, and people felt after a little while that this new sort of breakthrough in database technology should be applied to more than just the money use case, and different experiments were tried, and eventually Ethereum was brought forth as the most powerful, the most expressive or programmable system out there. When we proposed to build Ethereum, a lot of people in the Bitcoin space said it was impossible. You weren't going to be able to build something that complex and keep all those nodes, all those different computers, perfectly in sync, in consensus with one another. It would, the surface area was too big. It'll just break over and over, come out to consensus. And so we were able to define a very programmable system, a very powerful system, and get it to work and keep it working for a very long time. And it was sufficiently powerful so that we could experiment with this idea of building decentralized applications, a totally new paradigm, experiment with the idea of wrapping companies around these decentralized applications and see if we can commercialize this new kind of decentralized World Wide Web. And we did our best to make it as scalable as possible. We weren't very focused on making it private or confidential. We were trying to make it work. And so Ethereum 1.0 has seen different scalability and confidentiality mechanisms built into it and on top of it. And we can handle more use cases that way. And we're seeing tremendous advances in scalability. So the base layer can handle some around 20 transactions per second, depending on the kind of transaction. But we can anchor technology at layer 2 into layer 1 and get, in some cases, tens of thousands of transactions per second. So we're building out layer 1 already in terms of the weaknesses that it has had. But we still need to buff out layer 1 to beef it up. And so Ethereum 2.0 is all about turning that base trust layer into something that's much, much more powerful. And that'll magnify all the gains that we've made at layer 2 quite significantly.
I mean, that's going to be quite a project, right? Because particularly if you want to maintain, depending on how much of a purist one is with regards to the integrity of your blockchain, like how do you want to effectuate or operationalize that particular scalability? On the one hand, you can. Are you looking? I don't think. Are you looking or considering forking, or you're actually going to build?
So Ethereum 2.0 is being built. There are 9 teams, 7 major teams, nine teams total, that have been building it for a while. It's being built in 3 major phases. The first phase has 7 teams in sync with one another, coming to consensus with one another. And it's looking like we're going to be able to launch that in Q1 of next year. So possibly January, a very small number, a very small number of months from now.
Okay.
So that's the heartbeat of the system. That's the beacon chain. That's the proof of stake system. It will run in parallel to Ethereum 1.0, which is a proof of work system. We can talk about that if you want to. But essentially, like Microsoft releasing a new operating system, or brand, a paradigm-changing operating system. They keep the old one running. Lots of people keep using it, and the more advanced software houses build for the new system because they want to take advantage of the next great features. And so Ethereum 2.0 will get going very soon, and the next 2 major phases are probably going to be released together, because we have a team. We actually have 6 teams working on Ethereum 2.0, but we've got a team that is building out the next 2 phases simultaneously, and we're building it on the first phase. And so there's a decent chance, in my opinion, that Ethereum 2.0 will be functional before the end of 2020.
So you're moving from a proof of work system to a proof of stake system. Maybe you could sort of walk us through that, and then with some sort of specificity outline sort of how you view, how a proof of stake system would operate. Earlier today, we had some panels and some interesting debates about sort of the pros and cons of both systems, and the degree to which either one is capable of scaling up. Maybe you can sort of speak to, again, how you're thinking about a proof-of-stake system and that migration to a proof-of-stake system, and how you judged the competing sort of interests in terms of how you design this new strategy.
Okay, so it's a bit esoteric. We'll start with the basics.
Thanks.
Essentially, it's a new kind of database technology. We trade a whole lot of scalability for trust. We get trust by having massive decentralization, many computer nodes kept in sync by a consensus algorithm. All consensus algorithms everywhere, and there are lots of different examples of these historically, essentially elect a leader in some way, and they have everybody else follow in behind a leader. A very energy consumptive, inefficient way of electing a leader is by making all the different computers solve a complex puzzle. And so Bitcoin invented a decentralized way of electing a leader, and it was kind of the first really decentralized way in history. And unfortunately, it has become a very inefficient system. It burns an enormous amount of energy and wastes a lot of computation, requires specialized hardware, way more security cost than is necessary. Proof of stake replaces all of that waste with a crypto economic bond, basically. So if I have a bunch of Ether, I can stake it in a smart contract in a program on the blockchain, and that gives me the right to validate transactions and blocks on this network. If I behave badly, the software can come along and take away my security bond, essentially. And so proof of stake is far less wasteful, far more efficient, and it's actually more decentralized and more secure. It's more decentralized because the barrier to entry to participating is very low compared to proof of work, and the efficiencies of scale don't exist. So if I'm running a Chinese warehouse behind the Great Firewall, I have tremendous efficiencies of scale there. Messages moving across the firewall are disadvantaged. Messages in my own warehouse are advantaged, and you don't get that sort of thing in a proof-of-stake system. Anybody can put up a not too big amount of Ether and participate from probably an inexpensive computer.
In terms of ensuring, I'll try it this way. When you think about once you move to a proof-of-stake system, there are questions about concentration of economic power. How does that compare to Bitcoin in terms of how you sort of view decision-making on that blockchain?
Sure. So as I said, you don't have efficiencies of scale with proof of stake. Efficiencies of scale drive some aspects of centralization, and just access to the specialized hardware drives centralization. So Bitcoin turned into a hardware arms race, basically. So it's, unless you're able to access the latest hardware early, it's actually not cost effective to mine Bitcoin.
Looking forward, we had Chairman Tarbert here on Monday. And I don't know, you may have heard some statements recently about Ethereum and
Sure.
Ether. And he actually elaborated on those comments. It was quite interesting. And he made, in case you hadn't heard, not only did he sort of affirm that Ether is a commodity, thereby really sort of firmly making more concrete some statements that actually, I believe Bill Hinman and Chairman Clayton had made a bit earlier. And also said that within 6 months, he believed that there could be even sort of futures contracts for Ether traded. What do you think about that particular financialization of Ether? And how does that impact the way in which you do your business and you think about, an upgrade of the Ethereum blockchain?
Sure, so it makes perfect sense to me. It may not be a surprise that we said all those things a pretty long time ago. Essentially, we're seeing the IT industry on the planet transform. We used to have, and we still sort of do, essentially large software companies who have heavy sales forces, who do their business in a very clumpy way. And we're seeing the granularization of the delivery of software and software services, so software as a service in many different forms. We're also going to see a similar granularization of the hardware, storage, and bandwidth aspects of the IT industry, where it's not just going to be devices on your desktop. It's going to be devices in your pocket. It's going to be devices in your clothing, in the furniture, et cetera. And so we're moving into a world where this smart contract infrastructure sitting on blockchain networks is going to enable us to negotiate for provision and pay for software resources and hardware resources and storage, compute, and bandwidth. And so tokenization is going to enable me to provision and pay in real time. I may want to get some sort of job done a couple years now. I'll talk to Siri on my phone. I'll ask her to run some sort of machine learning algorithm. She may be able to do some of it on the phone, and she'll call some AWS server, and maybe there'll be some stuff that we can do on this table here that has embedded computation. So all that's going to get very real time and very granular. And we're going to have all these collaboration networks so that each of us spend some of our time, attention, resources in helping to compute or to just participate in these different collaboration networks for work and for leisure. We're putting up our resources, and we will expect some sort of compensation for that. What we will need as we move the whole IT infrastructure into this granular ecosystem that looks more like the energy ecosystem or the metals ecosystem, we're going to need financial instruments that enable us to manage our risks, so our pricing risks, et cetera. And so futures and options are going to be absolutely necessary as we provide services to those networks.
That's actually quite helpful because, the more you grow, there's one thing when it comes to developing new kinds of apps and your developer count and even getting some of those products to market. And our last panel for today was what does Wall Street want? And we have regulators and folks thinking about sort of monetization questions. But when you get to financialization does also introduce all kinds of other actors who have different sort of more indirect interests sort of in the marketplace. And it's always curious to sort of see to what degree that's greeted or is there a little bit more skepticism. I know that at one point you had mentioned, I'd read that the active developer count was over 200,000 folks.
Estimate.
When do you think that you'll see some of those products, sort of live products, coming to market? When you look at the build out of the ecosystem and you see that network and that ecosystem growing?
So we do have live products.
I'm sorry, more.
So we're a young ecosystem with a not very mature technology right now, and so the quote shrink wrap products are not very mature. We spend a lot of our time using the Ethereum technology, and we build for enterprises and governments and banks and central banks. We spend even more of our attention on building out the public Ethereum mainnet ecosystem, and so we actually see through the infrastructure that our company ConsenSys has built, we see days where there are 10 billion queries coming from our ecosystem. So we're building out better wallet systems. We're building out systems in the music industry and in journalism, and decentralized finance is, as I said before, it's really exploding. We need, so we've got the early stages of this base trust foundation for the planet, and upon that, we're building settlement layer. Upon that, we're building decentralized finance. So I think of it as the financial plumbing for the emerging digital economy. And once that gets really fleshed out, and it's moving incredibly quickly, there's composability in that layer so that all these different products or protocols can talk to one another. So you've got wallets talking to the lending systems that are talking to a lottery system. So it's really interesting. Once we have that more and more usable with greater liquidity, then more industries can start building on top of that.
So I'm about to turn it to the audience, but we are in Washington. We are the world of regulation, and certainly we've seen Chairman Tarbert and others sort of more firmly identify sort of the legal status of Ether. But you're still operating, and I think if you're anybody operating in the digital asset space, there's always some legacy of uncertainty out there, right? Because you're dealing with other entities, and even though you may be certain as to what you are, they may not necessarily be entirely certain as to how they will be sort of regulated, particularly when you get into DeFi and when you get into sort of the financial sort of infrastructure space. From your chair, how, it's a question I asked Brad, like how did you navigate and how do you continue to navigate just regulatory uncertainty? And are there things that when you come to Washington and you talk to policymakers, is there anything that you would, I mean, everyone would like to see more clarity, but are there specifically any kinds of either suggestions or ideas that you think could be useful in terms of generating more certainty for that ecosystem to evolve?
So we've been paying attention to regulatory issues since the start of the Ethereum project. I personally delayed the launch of the Ethereum crowd sale by a number of months until we felt like we had significant comfort from a prestigious law firm. At ConsenSys, we started the Brooklyn project, which is a project, so we've got a great group of lawyers at ConsenSys. One of them might be out there right now. And we have brought academics and regulators and industry together for lots of conversations. We've been very careful when we've issued tokens. Believe we've done a good job staying on the right side of the Securities Act. And we are comfortable that we can issue both tokenized securities in a regulatorily compliant way as well as utility tokens. It's a powerful new technology, and essentially we need to have lots of dialogues within society, within different jurisdictions, because certain things will be acceptable in some jurisdictions and not in others. We need to figure out how we want to see this technology used in society. So it should not be about regulating the technology itself. It should be about regulating the use of the technology. Essentially, TCP/IP is an agnostic technology, or it's a technology that can be used for virtually anything. And the internet at a certain layer is largely unregulated. It's what companies and people in different jurisdictions have been doing with it that starts people having those discussions and making rules about that. So I feel like Ethereum and related technologies are incredibly powerful, and we will probably want a permissionless layer at the base. That'll be the base trust layer. But on top of that, there will be lots of identified entities that transact according to the laws of their jurisdictions.
Excellent. Okay, Hans, there's a gentleman right next to you, and then afterwards we'll come up to the front.
Yeah, I was wondering.
And feel free to identify yourself.
My name is Matthew. I'm a web developer. I was wondering what sort of advice you have for web developers and entrepreneurs within this space.
Well,
How do you get started and build
How do you get
build
started?
an Ethereum blockchain or an Apple?
there's a lot of information on the internet. So I feel like Web 2 has tremendous capabilities in technology, but in some cases, in many cases, it's sort of veered off in concerning directions. The internet was sort of advertised as a decentralized network a while ago, and because of efficiencies, because of essentially the nature of commerce and power, the web has become a set of walled gardens, and because it didn't really have a native money construct, and because it didn't have a native identity construct, the default business model for the internet ended up being advertising. And that went reasonably okay for a little while, and then I think it's effectively gone off the rails. Technology is just too powerful at this point, and it's being wielded by very smart people, and it's hurting most of us, and it is tearing the fabric of societies. So Web 3.0 represents a new paradigm. It's going to take a while for us to figure out how to effectively deploy it, but I believe it will be much more respectful of people's attention and information. I believe that it'll enable people to have much greater agency in the networks in which they operate, and I believe it'll emphasize collaboration and facilitate collaboration over competition.
Next, two questions.
Hanna Zupko, co-founder and CEO of Intellect.eu. Joe, as a founder of ConsenSys, I'm curious whether you see yourself further focusing on building applications and further developing exclusively Ethereum ecosystem, or rather collaborating also with a broader blockchain ecosystem, other technology frameworks. And then in broader sense, I would be curious to hear about your plans for ConsenSys for the next 1 to 3 years.
So
I think we're going to take two questions because there are quite a few, and then you can answer both of them.
So, Tom Gross with George Washington University.
Good luck.
So 3 days of this conference, and I don't think I've heard anyone use the words quantum computer. So, we have Ethereum, ERC20, everything I look at, everyone's based on ERC20, even though other better tokens I think have come out, people don't seem to want to switch away to it. And everything seems to be based on SHA-256. So is this whole thing going to collapse when quantum computers mature, which in my opinion is happening a lot faster than people realize? I'm only aware of a small handful of companies addressing these issues. I think Nexus in Scottsdale is one. They're trying to build a SHA-1024 system. How is this going to play out in your mind?
Two very different questions.
Yeah, so I can answer the second one first because it's an easy one. You need quantum algorithms in order to make use of quantum computers, and we're still a fair distance, despite what Google recently said, we're still a fair distance away from really viable quantum computer systems. And we already know so many different ways to operate in a quantum safe way. So Ethereum can use Shor signatures or Lamport signatures. It's not a concern. It's it's as much a concern for the banking systems as it is for blockchain systems, and we'll, unless the NSA has a 20-year head start or 15-year head start, which is possible, we'll get good telegraphing of when we need to change things. That's the way it's been working in cryptography for a very long time. I believe the previous questions were about whether we pay attention to work or do work outside of the Ethereum ecosystem. Is that the first phase?
And your plans for 1 to 3 years, where do you see
But that was the first part of the question?
Well, whether it's exclusively Ethereum or
So
whether
yeah, we're not,
The question being
we
exclusively.
we use the best technology available, and the Ethereum technology is really good for public blockchain infrastructure, and it's as good as anything else, probably better than everything else for private permissioned network systems. That said, we have people that we've hired from IBM and R3 who are very good with the Fabric and the Corda technology, and we have one project that sort of came out of the R3 space, and it's now a project that we're closely associated with that is using the Corda technology. But we do see an interledger world, and are happy to see interoperation between different networks. At this point, we don't see much utility in building new systems using non-Ethereum technology. We do anticipate seeing sort of layer 2 Ethereum networks linked into the base trust layer, and sort of like the node system. It just makes sense to use the same technology at multiple layers of a complex architecture that you're building. What are we doing in ConsenSys over the next few years? More of the same, more coherent. We have streamlined very significantly into a software product company. And so we are building a very coherent software product offering that enables anybody to spin up blockchain. So it's sort of a launch pad for blockchain networks.
Hi, thank you so much for coming by, first of all. I'm Shivani. I'm a Master's of Law student at the Georgetown University Law Center. So my question is a little more philosophical. Capitalism, I thought, strived on the scarcity principle, and with the kind of development that we are having in technology, digital asset technology, trade, money, and assets are going to be available to people sooner or later. How do you think that's going to change the economics of things?
It's really hard to hear that. How do I think that blockchain economics?
Well, it's like ultimately, to the extent to which you're getting all these new use cases, and whether, for example, one of your initial comments was, well, we're not. When you think about Ether in particular, it's not just a money, but it's the fuel for a larger application. How does that ultimately then sort of end up impacting economics, especially when you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, because you're getting all these new kind of money-like sort of, I guess, I'm interpreting this, sort of applications, building new money-like products on top of the blockchain. Are you thinking that you could end up changing the way in which economics is operating?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it will change the way economics operates. I think not the deep principles, but yeah, natively digital assets will transform everything. We're essentially seeing a digitization of global society, and effectively up to this point, everything that we do in transactions references analog constructs. So money is effectively analog, even if it's digitized in centralized databases. Identity's analog, our agreements are analog, the justice system is analog. We, at our company and others in our space, have created natively digital versions of all of those things. These are versions that are realized first on decentralized database systems, and because of the trust that you get from that, because of the digitization, it squeezes all of the delays and the frictions out of every transaction in society. So anything that would have involved money, clearing, settlement, identity, has the clearing and settlement that extends over hours, days, or weeks in some cases. And we're compressing all of that into the instant of the transaction. So it'll get much more efficient. And I think the velocity of growth in society is going to be different. So I think that's a qualitative difference, but we're all going to have to see how that ramifies.
That's actually interesting. I mean, the velocity of money itself could change. As you can see, we have about 33 seconds left for this particular panel, and I just see some really eager people, but unfortunately we're going to have to keep it here. We will be going into the economic question with the heads of major players as well as New York regulators in our last session on money and monetization. But Mr. Lubin, Joe, thank you so very, very much for taking the time to talk to us about this. Thank you.